Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD, Candid Conversations with Patti Kasper. This podcast is for those who are living with the effects of prenatal exposure to alcohol, their loved ones, and anyone else wanting to learn more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Each week, you'll hear from someone whose expertise is either professional or living experience with FASD. I'm your host, Patti Kasper, bringing you both. Now let's get started with another candid conversation. Today you should hopefully recognize my two guests, Ms. Jodee Kulp and Ms. Antonia Rathbun Lindsay, both of whom are relatively frequent guests on the podcast. Today is the second time we are gathering everybody together as Team Meliorist. So we call ourselves, and there's one more, Deb Evenson, who is unable to join us today, but she'll be in the next episode of this new sub-series called Meliorist Mondays. Jodee was last on with me the beginning of May. Antonia was last on with me the beginning of April. Deb was on mid-March. And so what we decided to do, because the four of us gather every week, and we kick around ideas and concepts in FASD, things that we have gone back to from the early days and pulling from other disciplines and really taking a look at what really works in the field of FASD and how do we collectively share these gems with the world so that they don't get lost, so that they're not abandoned, because it's not current research, and current research is important, don't get me wrong, but it has to be both, right? It's not either or, it's this and that. And so we are inviting you as the viewer or listener into our world as we kick some ideas around. And we wanted to start this mini series with a deep dive into one of the core concepts that the four of us operate under, and that is that FASD primarily is a neurological insult to the brain. And therefore it needs, without the brain determines all functioning. So when the brain structure is changed, the way it functions is changed. And that really has a major impact on development. So the four of us emphasize a developmental approach to what we do, as opposed to a psychological or cognitive approach. And that's just kind of where we come from. And we wanted to invite you into our circle and into our candid conversations as we kick this around a little bit.
And we're discussing this amazing and wonderful example in a life that has meant so much to the field.
So ladies, good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning.
Good morning, Patti.
Yeah, and speaking of morning, where Jodee and I are recording from, it is 8:30, 9 o'clock. Deb is 3 hours behind, which is why she's not with us. I'm recording early because I want to get the session done with so my dogs don't bark through the whole thing. We're having our fence put up in our backyard. So in the hopes of having a quiet recording space.
Unless the drives by.
Yeah. I have all the blinds are down, so hopefully they'll be quiet. All right, so with that, let's get going. So Jodee, I wanted to remind everybody of your episode that we did a month ago, right? May 5th. If you haven't listened to that, everybody, yet, or watched it yet, go back and do that at some point. And because Jodee is such a prolific author when it comes to the FASD space, she has contributed so much. And so just to kind of summarize that, Jodee, you started with expressions of just that parenting experience in terms of poetry, and it was deeply moving. But then Liz, your daughter, said, I want to write a book too. And she was not reading or writing yet, so she dictated, you wrote things on note cards. Take it away from there. Who helped you with this next step, and how did you get to such a critically important approach?
All right. So I had recipe cards, and I would write on, as she said about her brain, we'd ask a question and she would tell me, because she was very verbal, very incredibly articulate. And she would tell me what she thought when I asked the question. And I would write it carefully, very nice printed, because she still could not read cursive as an adult. I would write it very carefully for her on a recipe card, which was about as much information as she could handle. And the stack just kept growing. Meanwhile, I was looking at ways to help her because I had just worked on helping her learn to read and write, just beginning. I mean, just the beginning. We were using Orton Gillingham, and she was unable to make that connection between a sound, a letter sound, which we would say as a letter, and make it into a word. So cat was always C-A-T. It was never cat. She couldn't connect that. So if she was reading, it would be C-A-T-I-S. No, not C-A-T. Cat is. That had to be then stepped down much lower than ABC. It had, and because the ABCs were just not her friend. And we then took that into phonograms, which then made the alphabet be a, k, s, d. And that was a neurological approach to learning to read that they had worked on in the 1940s in developing reading for people that had major brain trauma to be able to learn to reread again. And it was also a motor thing. So it was not just learning the sounds, but it was actually using the intentional hand positioning and intentional sitting in a certain way and breathing and then writing the letters intentionally based on a round clock, which she still doesn't know how to do the round clock on the time, but she definitely knows how to do the clock on the letters. So she didn't connect those two, but she did connect the thing. And she ended up becoming an incredible being able to print beautiful work. And if you look at what she copied from my cards that I wrote on our interview to her book, it was pretty nice printing. You know, it was really actually very accurate. And if you understand the Orton Gillingham approach, or you understand that she was making those very intentionally and doing a really good job. So we had written this whole thing. And meanwhile, I'm a mom and I'm passionate about trying to help this kid because I'm thinking there's no way she's going to get to adulthood being a non-reader, non-writer, and she could do math in her head, but she couldn't do it on paper. So this was, there were just a lot of
pretty
gaps.
Incredible.
Yeah. Well, we played games when she was little. So we read a lot of books and played a lot of, like, I'm thinking of something. So she had some pieces that were higher level that skipped other things. And I'm sure some of it was just the games we played and we didn't know how to do things sequentially. We just didn't know. And I was on a listserv, and this is where Antonia and I and Deb first met, and it was in the 90s. And it was, there was no pictures on the internet. It was just text. You would type a thing and someone else would type a thing.
I think a lot of people would call those forums, right?
They call them forums now. They were called listservs at that time.
Okay.
And we would do this listserv together. And there was a woman that came on that made some comments. And I thought, she's very interesting. Very interesting. So I wrote her and said, do you work with fetal alcohol? And she said, well, the thing out there is, this was before we were brain plasticity people, right? This was before we talked about brain injury because of fetal alcohol. This was before that time. And I had been writing case notes of what we were doing and helping her. And, we at that point were using
Helping Liz.
Yes, helping Liz. And so we had changed our diet. We are on gluten-free. Nobody did gluten-free hardly there unless you had celiac. And it was, our whole kitchen had been emptied and rebuilt. Not rebuilt, just the food. We didn't have the money.
So you were literally restructuring everything for Liz from the very core of her functioning out towards other skills that other people would recognize as childhood skills.
Yes. Could her body move? Could she breathe? Could she,
that's
getting the best fuel?
Yeah. And that's an important point that we had talked about, before the cameras were rolling. We had talked about before that Liz came to you diagnosed as failure to thrive.
Mhm.
Now, it's very common for, I mean, everybody's heard that term, but I
Right.
think most, kind of like FASD, everyone's heard of it, but their understanding is very limited. I think with failure to thrive, most people tend to think they're just not putting on weight.
Right.
With it's so much more than that.
Well, she had an
What
eating
was
problem.
there?
We didn't know she couldn't suck.
Right.
She wasn't rooting and sucking, but we didn't know what that was. And so you'd rub her lips, or you'd do whatever you could, like you do. I mean, I work with animals, so you do what you do with animals to help her be able to, she's got to eat food.
In the hospital, they would have us put on a finger cot, and for the babies, the extreme preemie babies that we were working with there, they would have us put on a finger cot and try and stim the inside of the lips and see if the children reacted with a horrible abnormal startle, or if they were able to slowly tolerate that before they would introduce a bottle with a preemie nipple, which
Good
was
idea.
very specialized appliance. And even then, many of the babies had trouble latching onto it, and they needed different kinds of holding and body positioning and light exposure or dark exposure, just to be able to organize enough to have that sucking reflex work, even for 5 seconds at a time.
It had to be very short. That's
Really
what everything,
short.
really short. In fact, I would squeeze the bottle into her mouth so she'd get it. She never closed her mouth, so she had her mouth always open.
So it was dripping out of her mouth.
But I did find out that when I wore her under my sweatshirt, and I covered her, and then she did not stiffen so much. She actually relaxed. And so I actually carried her under a big old sweatshirt for months before she was able to start.
This is one of those pieces, because academically I've known that a very common symptom is the lack of the suck reflex, right? But it's one of those pieces that trickled into my awareness as time goes on. I've said before that once you recognize that you have FASD, you don't get all these connections all at once because you can't process that many things at one time. And one of those things that I became aware of after a little bit of time was that I had that issue as well.
Yeah.
And what made me realize that is one of my mother's favorite, I don't know if it's story because it's kind
comment
of
in passing,
but yeah, one of her habitual comments, because I eat very slowly, was that even as a baby, it would take hours to get me to eat a decent amount. I would suck for a moment and then drift off. And then she'd have to keep, it was very laborious for her. And it's like, I didn't have that reflex.
And weak suck and falling asleep at the nipple is something that's mentioned in the lists of the diagnostic information. But if people haven't held somebody who's doing that or cared for somebody who's doing that, they may not connect those things. But when Jodee was doing her systematic way of trying to understand what was happening, even with sucking and breathing, because in order to effectively swallow, you have to suck, swallow, and take the next breath. That's the neurological sequence: suck, swallow, breathe.
And that's scary.
If a person can't close their mouth at all, how do they swallow effectively and get very much in there? Because it's the closed mouth that allows all the volume that's in the mouth to go down the throat versus coming out of the mouth.
So one of the things you asked me a little earlier was, what was the trajectory, or what happened? So I wrote to this woman who said, I'm coming through Minneapolis, headed to Virginia, and I'd be happy to stop and see you. Now it was 30 below that day, right? And I brought her a copy of all of Liz's note cards. And
This the woman from the listserv.
The woman from the listserv. Yeah, her name was Tony Hager. And I brought her a copy from the listserv, and she said, we don't know what we can do with FASD. I haven't worked with anyone with that. I don't have any idea if I can do anything. I can tell you what I know. I can tell you what the kids I have worked with and what has happened with them. We can try some things. It was the same response I got from my clinical nutritionist and sports doctor. I don't know what can be done. You have a little animal there. I mean, because she would literally melt down in his office. But I know Down syndrome because I had a child with Downs. I know schizophrenia. I know sports medicine. I know clinical nutrition. How about if we just pull it all together and we see what we can do? So now I have these two professionals. His name was Dr. Brist. I have these two professionals that are curious. And curiosity, I have found, is the most important thing in this whole thing. So you got mom curious and two professionals that are curious, that are not making any recommendations but they're going to their history, their notebooks.
They're digging in their archive. If they see something that cues, they'll pluck from their archive and say, what about this maybe?
Right.
But they're trusting the trial and error with you.
Yeah. And so what they said to me, both of them, was, if you're willing to work, I'm willing to commit. But you have to promise to follow through. And seriously, what we're going to show you is the follow through of this, because it's not something you just do randomly. You continuously do it. But it doesn't mean it has to be painful. It's fun. And I found at that point that everything I was told, I had to creatively make that fun for Liz to be willing to do it. It had to be play. So I had to take the professional analytical, let's do it, and repetition.
Take the task and turn it into a fun thing.
And turn it into fun for her. And then take that task.
Training the reflex. One other thing, if you're training the reflex system, it's not like training voluntary motor activity.
No.
It's training the autonomic patterns where there are gaps.
So what is the autonomic, Antonia? Can you tell me what the autonomic is?
The autonomic system is the thing that controls our body's ability to blink. We don't have to tell our eyes, blink now.
It doesn't start with an idea. Maybe I should blink.
No. And Liz didn't blink, and she had no reflexes. So if you hit her knee, didn't move,
Right.
Yeah, there was.
So how to coach a child in skill development whose body isn't even responding to a sensory environment in an organized way like other bodies.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So this ties right in with something that we said at the beginning, that we really, I want to introduce everyone to our other concept. Aside from neurologic, our approach is rehabilitative and habilitative. Now, most people, most people are familiar with rehab, right? You think that's a place where you are admitted for a couple months after a bad accident and maybe head trauma or a stroke.
You have to learn to again or move again.
Something like that. Yeah. And when you go into rehab, they ask tons of questions and they ascertain your baseline. What was your level of functioning before the insult to the body or the insult to the brain? And let's use that as our goal, and we will work to get there. But with FASD, we have no idea what that baseline would or should have been. So it's not.
There's no baseline to return to.
Exactly.
So the first time.
So it's finding out what are the gaps in reflex development, in skill development.
Yes.
And that explains why with FASD, you have such a scattering of findings. You can do this, you can't do that. You can do it some days, but not other days. And so it's more habilitative.
Yes.
Building those things initially.
Yes.
And I think, Jodee, you had said at one point in one of our conversations that Liz did not, most people know, they may not know the name of it, but when you have a little baby and you startle it, they go, right? That's called the
Right.
Mara reflex. And Liz was what, 14 when she developed that reliably?
The startle reflex is this, right?
Okay.
And she
That's
would
Moro.
startle if she got anxious, she'd startle too, right?
Yeah.
That's Moro.
But then she would go like this.
And that's writing. That's called writing.
And what she did at 14 was she fell and she did this, put her hands out, and she came to me and said, Mom, I did something I think really wrong. I said, what did you do? She said, well, I fell and I put my arms in front of me so that, I didn't just like plant my face on the concrete. She didn't say
Right?
that, but I'm like, oh my goodness, I am so happy because this is something that happens when a baby's learning to walk, right? It's a reflex that allows the baby to not fall. I mean, and if they fall, they can keep themselves safe because they can move their
They
body.
call it the writing reflex. And if you practice it with a baby, you have them belly down on a large occupational therapy ball. And as they move forward, as you gently move their head forward, their little arms are supposed to come up in front of them. You have to train them like bringing the little arms up in front of them so that they protect their face.
Exactly.
And it can be trained in.
And that's what we did because when we met when I met Tony and this is kind of, it's 30 below zero. She's coming on a bus. I'm like, what professional comes on a bus? I have no idea. But, mothers in this kind of situation are creative and we have no fear. We're just going to go find help for our kiddo. That's what we're going to do.
You sat down with a stranger at the Greyhound station.
With cocoa, with a thermos of cocoa.
And layers and layers and layers of clothing.
And yeah, it looked like the Michelin Man. And so I came into and we met and our eyes were just like, how when you meet somebody and your eyes meet them and you just say, I want to work with this person. That was the way it was with Tony. It was like, and she again, I had she asked me to make some pictures of Liz and I brought some and then I brought the copies and she laughed and she said, well, I've never had one of my clients ever give me their whole history and write it themselves. This is quite exciting. And at this point it was going to be the Best I Can Be book, but she had already copied all the pages over. And then she looked at me and the pictures and she said, did she ever close her mouth? And I go, oh yeah, she closes her mouth. That's not a problem. Well, I went home and I started looking at books of baby pictures, school pictures. She never closed her mouth. Not one picture in all of that had her mouth closed. Now, I've lived with this child for almost 13 years. And she's never shut her mouth. Now, we thought that was probably the case because she never stopped talking. But it wasn't that. It wasn't that. So we, and she said, I'm coming back through town from Virginia. Would you meet me again and bring Liz? I want to meet her. I want to meet her in this Greyhound station. I was like, okay. Now, what you need to know is that because she did not want to charge her clients much money, she took the Greyhound across country and used it for research time. So she did her study and her quiet time on the bus to get to her next client. And we just happened to then be in the middle so she can come and eventually stay in a bed, and become part of our family. Yeah, so that was, she said, I think you've got a mouth breather here and not a nose breather. And I need to look at her. I need to really look at her. So we brought Liz and she brought her sister Anna, who also was a little chatterbox. And by the way, I thought prenatal exposed, but not. And as Anna lived in our home, pieces just connected so quickly.
Clear.
It was environmental issues that she had to deal with. And, she's college degreed, educated mom, but that's not where we started when I first pulled her out of a fisticuffs. Yeah, so Liz and she were best friends. They were sisters. And I brought them both and Tony's watching and she has Liz do some walks and then she laughs at me. She said, you don't know how hard it is to do my job because I analyze people wherever I go. And I say, oh, they're missing this and this. I could help them with that. And she said, I can give you a program right now. Would you like me to give you a program that I could give you right now and you work it? And if you promise to do it, it was 3 times a day for 10 minutes, maybe not even 10 minutes, but it's very small. I mean, sometimes it was just, she said, if she fatigues, just stop. Keep it fun, keep it light, keep it
That's
enjoyable.
fun.
And meanwhile, the clinical nutritionist is working on getting us fully armed up and healthy and food and extra supplements but not so many that are overwhelming, just exactly what she needed because he took the time to do the blood work that was necessary to find the real pieces, not just the generic blood work that's done normally. So we had some ammunition and then my job was to keep case notes, and I'd been keeping case notes as I was training her in school, but they got more detailed. And so I just kept, was there something that I could cross-reference? Was there something that was consistent? Was there, and I had this stack of paper that I put together eventually in a wire-bound book and gave it to 40. I think I printed 40 copies and gave it to 40 people. So if you've got one of those, it's the original case notes. And then from there was told, you've really got to publish this. This is important. And then I published it in 2004 and republished a revision in 2013. So that was her journey. She changed. In 18 months, we did not have the same person.
Yeah. Out of this, what you created was you took a way of getting all this data, which is very linear because you created it over time. And we tend to use a linear concept to do time progression.
Right.
And you turned it into something more useful, that more holistic, that you could get a better snapshot.
Because not only was it linear, but it was stacked. So, I had piles of paper all over of different things that had different problems and different, and we weren't into the digital world in the same way as we are today. I mean, we were, but not like we are today. It was a different world in the 1990s. So would you like me to share what we came up with?
I would. That was, right. I was hoping you would do that at this point. And this is because it is stacked. That's why you call this a vortex.
Exactly. Because it's not what the center and of course, and the reason it's colored is because I love color, but I also wanted to be able to delineate between the different sections quickly. So what you don't see here is that I put the blue visual, which is in the corner of sensing, I put everything into the blue pile. So I could find it quickly in my research. All the research that was visual was also blue. I mean, it wasn't blue paper, but it was in the blue basket, right? And I just had all these colored baskets that I could dig into if I needed to, or color file folders to do that. But
now, I think hang on one second. I want to pretend to be Antonia for a minute and create a word picture so that people can really get this, because vortexes are like a three-dimensional thing. Like if you drain your bathtub, you open that drain and you see, whoops, there goes my microphone. And you see the water go down, like a tornado, right? As it empties. That's a vortex. So that's what we're really looking at here, is a three-dimensional model, not two-dimensional.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in Fascinating Journey, it's actually drawn as a three-dimensional model. So yeah. So we started with the core metabolic. So metabolic has always been the core for me. It's always been the most important thing for me. And that piece continued through adulthood, childhood, and then into adolescence, and then into inebriation, which was significant because she had a huge alcohol problem and we had to rebuild the brain at that point. And then she ended up getting pancreatitis, which her body shut down and she gained 60 pounds of fluid. So it was a pretty significant, and she was in ICU for a long time. Had to rebuild after that. And
So
then
you did both habilitation when she was 13 to 15, and then you rehabbed her again and
yes,
again with these other insults.
using the same
Yeah.
assessments and strategies to find
Yeah.
out where to start and strengthening always the lower foundations and making sure the foundations were solid before we built upon them. So when she was brain stunned in dialysis and her gut was stunned, and then when she had the car accident and was sideswiped and she lost her vision, and when she had 3 brain surgeries, each time there, I began with the core to rebuild or rehabilitate her, knowing what I knew from the habilitation. That's true.
Yeah.
So core is things like being able to control the muscles, both from the mouth all the way to the abdomen, the vagal system, of being able to inhale and exhale completely, being able to swallow one's saliva, having blinking reflexes, things that go on in that keep the body dialed in so it can do the rest of its skills that we don't have to ask the body to do on purpose.
Right.
It
The
handles it
autonomic stuff.
automatically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of this was what they call or refer to as sensory integration. You know, it was coded as sensory integration disorder, but and it all goes together. The body is a body, the brain is a brain. When the sensory system can handle something, it can handle it. But if it's insulted again, if it's hurt again, you might go back to the same place you were before and have to start rehabilitating again. Yeah. So I want to show you a picture of Liz. How's that for an idea? So this is a core slide. This is when we got Liz at the top and her mouth is open. And the bottom one is after working with Tony for about a month of practicing learning to close our mouth. So you can see she actually closed her mouth, at least for the picture, and was able to trust breathing through her nose. And that was a really scary thing because she thought if she shut her mouth, she was going to die. She thought if she chewed with her mouth closed, she was going to die. And so, you know, I make a joke about it, but her dad wore a raincoat and tried to stay out of the way for the spilled milk. But the reality is if you talk and chew and don't close your mouth when you're eating, there was a lot of table wiping up after that. It just kind of was part of that. And yet it wasn't her fault, right? This was something that needed to be habilitated and restored and put into place for her.
She wasn't chewing and spitting it at people. She couldn't close her mouth.
Right, exactly.
And swallow.
Right. Some people think it's psychological. It was not psychological.
Not psychological.
It was metabolic and neurological is what it was. So, you know, that's what we were embracing. We were embracing the metabolic, neurological. How did it all work? You know, what was the speed of it? You know, and now as an animal behavior person, you know, how fast can they sit? Well, it wasn't about that kind of speed, right? It's about could she even accomplish it?
Yeah.
Could she stand on one foot? Could she jump? Could she lift her body off the ground? And you can't do skipping if you can't lift your foot up, if you have to shuffle, which happens as we get older too. We tend to shuffle because, you know, a lot of that there's a lot of power in this rehabilitation piece. So on the side where the vortex is, you can see the dark gray. The dark gray is where we started, and there are holes in it. You can see there's holes and dots all over the place. The holes are the places where we have entered into intermittently. Those are the things that some days you can do, some days you can't do. Some mornings you can do it, but you can't do it in the afternoon.
So each of these dots in the dark gray that look like white dots, those are tasks that she could do intermittently.
Yes, meaning sometimes. And we always said, if she can get there sometimes, we can get there again, right? Yeah. So, but we have to build the foundation underneath to do that. And if you look at the gray chart, the visual and tactile, which is the sensory and the eyes, were her lowest. And her auditory wasn't much better. She had auditory vision, she had auditory processing disorder and visual processing disorder and sensory integration disorder. So they were, you know, and then the social behavior and the emotionality, of course, would was just, above and beyond what most people would want to deal with or even believe, because what you do is you isolate in your home and you keep the child safe, and you make sure that when you do go out, things are managed very closely, and you're keeping them, they're calm. And yeah, and even as an adult, we had to do that. I learned how to bring my energy down to such a point, kind of meekness, where you have the ability to do whatever you need to do, but
So you would dial into automatic calm in order to give her an anchor to match.
Absolutely.
Otherwise,
and I think we
swept away by the waterfall of stimulation around her.
And we talked about that last time, when we were talking about how the medical professionals referred to you as, what was the phrase they used?
A passive mother.
A passive mother.
Yes, I was a passive mother. It was, I mean, I'm looking in the medical records, because we have 100,000 pages of medical records. I'm trying to at least give a chart if somebody decides to use it for research. So they've got a map or a guide to, look at the high points, and then they can dig into deeper. But one of them they've given her a medication she's paradoxical for. That means she reacts opposite. So the thing that was supposed to put her to sleep made her dance and jump. And then
the things that were supposed to be sedating wound her up.
Yes. And so when they came, and the story's long and funny, but I'm not going to share that. But anyway, so she's wound up, and I'm calming down. The more she winds up, the further I go down, right?
Exactly.
And the nurse comes in, and she's all upset because I'm not doing anything. Well, I know that if I do something,
you were doing something. You were remaining completely calm and giving her a signal to come back to you, because you're the thing that's not swirling in the midst of all of that jumble.
Exactly. And the medical community didn't understand it. And a number of times that happened until they started seeing the difference of her being with me during procedures and complications, and her being with other people during that time. And they could see that there was a strategy here. It was intentional. It wasn't that because then they'd see me advocating or working.
I didn't see you necessarily grabbing her body and say, "Sit down, dear," or things like that. You were doing the typical things that they would expect, because they were seeing from a psychological point of view. They weren't looking at her from a neurological point of view. And you were constantly working with her as a person with a neurological injury.
Exactly. And metabolic, so, the blood has to get to the brain, and the oxygen has to get to the brain. And that's what nose breathing is so important, right? Because you're able to get that in. So if you look at the chart again and you see the light gray, that's where we reached 18 months later. So you can see now, and we got into, we still had work on emotionality and auditory and visual. We're still struggling, and gross motor was still struggling. And tactile was still struggling. Obviously, you can see that. But we were making inroads. We were making inroads, and we were hitting markers. We were hitting tasks. And each task we hit that we were able to, we celebrated. We did a lot of celebration.
And what many counselors would call that would be, oh, so your child was starting to meet milestones? Sort of intermittently, yes. She had some milestones that were consolidating. And that were still sporadic.
Yeah. And what Tony said is, Joan, a brain can do what a brain can do when a brain can do it.
I love that.
And so when her brain is able to do it, it can happen. And that could be, again, if her best time of day was 2:00 in the afternoon, you might not get anything at 10. You might not get anything at 8 at night, but at 2:00,
she could do it.
You could do some things. So then you have to look at the environment and say, what's happening in that environment? And not just the environment where you live, but what's happening in that environment around her body, around what's going on, about the time of eating and the processing of food and how much sleep. And, then you're looking at a whole big picture in order to dig down.
Looking at the ecosystem So you're looking at the symptoms she's showing and the skills she's gaining.
Yes.
And the ecosystem in which that's happening.
And can I duplicate that ecosystem in a different time of day so that we can not just have it right here, but could we have it at 10 in the morning, or could we have it at 7 at night? And
can
we
could replicate it a little bit more during the day. Can we extend it a little bit?
Right. And when is too close and when is too far, so, and can we have it in the kitchen, and can we have it in the living room, and can I use the same behavior and get the same response outside or in the community?
Right.
And
that's something that we talk about in facets a lot with that neurobehavioral approach. Our kids often, or people oftentimes, have trouble generalizing knowledge or skills from one specific setting to others.
Yeah. We use what we call bridges or generalization items. So we had things that she could either wear or put in her pocket, or a smell or something that she could anchor at a moment where she was functional, right? Where things were functioning well, and then have that bridge go with us to the park or
and
to
in
the
young
store.
childhood, preschool and kindergarten, they'll say, oh, does your child still carry a transitional object? Meaning that, their little nurner from when they were little, that's a security item, for example.
Linus and his blanket in the Peanuts cartoon.
They're used to, they're used to thinking about that, but they don't think about it in terms of other connectors. You were developing connectors to help her associate that same activity in a new setting, environment by environment by environment.
And I'm grateful for her, because in my animal work, I use the same strategy with animals and families to duplicate. Now they learn to do it. So we find a transitional object that they can take. Like, for example, for an animal, I would use a rug. I would use a blue rug that you can buy at a small store for $2, right? And I'd say, buy 3 of these rugs. I want 1 rug in your house. I want 1 rug in your car that you can take with you to grandma's. And I want 1 rug in your washing machine, because you're going to need a backup. And you can do the same with a stuffed animal. I mean, like you can do 3. Have one that you can put in the washer if you need to. You never know what's going to happen. But what happens there for the animal is that if they go to a soccer game and they know how to sit on the rug, and the rug goes on the grass, they know how to sit on the rug, which is a transition to allow them to watch the soccer game. So, it's a comfort thing. Yeah. So I'm going to show you what we did so you get an idea. We then took this is the whole chart, and it's almost as overwhelming as the paper, right? Except that at least we have a place to put it together. And we started doing activities and charting them. So this is flip-flop, and this is where flip-flop, which is rolling over like, doing a baby roll, actually helps the body. So these are the areas in level 1 and level 2 for gross motor where it makes a difference.
But it's also vestibular.
Yes.
It is vestibular.
It is vestibular.
Very vestibular. It's neuromotor, and it's also vestibular, because everything that's going on in changing position of the eyes changes the system of balance. No matter where your eyes go, it registers in your balance centers.
We don't think about this, but in bottle feeding a baby, right? And a lot of instead we've got 2 breasts, and we can't breastfeed in one breast only, because you've got to empty the other breast. But in bottle feeding, you have a bottle and you have a favored arm. Right. And so if you are only holding the baby with that favored arm and that bottle, that baby is only getting one side of the visual.
That's right.
Picture, and they're not getting the other side. So they're getting, a scent pattern and vision. So you can see how this core, and it's so easy for us to not know what we don't know, right?
Right.
And yet if we knew it, Of course we'd make that
We'd
adjustment.
switch arms, we'd feed them from the other elbow.
Right.
We'd be able to broaden the skill set we're coaching.
Exactly.
It isn't just about feeding. It's about feeding, relaxing, accepting comfort, slowly becoming able to sleep from that place.
Well, and having
And
approaching
thinking,
people approach, right? Because if you're laying one side and a person approaches from that side, but you're never seeing approach from the other side, it becomes complicated in that area too. So yeah, little things affect big things.
oh, and I'm also thinking of information being able to cross that midline,
Exactly.
developing,
Exactly.
right. So, and that has all
Because
kinds of crazy spillovers.
the whole position, when you're bottle feeding, we talked about this, the suck, swallow, breathe sequence, but there's a whole nother pattern of primitive reflexes that affect the arm position and leg position of the infant as they reach toward the breast. And those come online and then fade out as other skills come online. So if you never change sides, they only learn to do those movement patterns to one side.
That's
Talk
right.
about not crossing the midline. People have literally inadvertently, totally by accident, passed on the inability the inability to cross the midline because they didn't shift the child's body position so that the limbs had to move towards the breast.
So let's talk about.
So does this play into being right-handed or left-handed or ambidextrous?
I don't know.
That I don't know.
I don't know. I do know a lot about midline because Liz played the harp and we did Suzuki, and Suzuki was the first methodology that we figured out, pedagogy that we figured out that she functioned with. And it was small enough baby steps and it was tiny enough that she could do it. Now, from the time she started at 6 until the time she was 12 or 13, she was still in book 1. And she was no longer in group classes where Suzuki thrives because she wasn't 4 years old already in book 2, right? And we were then doing private lessons with the orchestra hall first chair harpist in her home. And she liked Liz. She was curious. Again, another curious person. And she brought me a book called Brain Gym. So when Tony started introducing some of these exercises, I told her, I said, oh yeah, we've tried that. Brain Gym doesn't work. And she said, well, tell me how she does the dishes. And I said, well, she's like, if I go, I guess I got to think about it. So then you got to use your visual and you got to say, okay, well, she stands at the sink where the hot water is and the soap. And then she moves over and turns on the water. And then she moves over and rinses. And she's, oh, I thought so.
She doesn't reach across the midline.
I said, does she ever reach across I said, no, she just moves over.
No, she moves over.
And she said, we've got some work to do.
Steps back.
Yeah. She said, there's no way she can do Brain Gym, which is a wonderful program.
Yeah.
And it's going to only frustrate her until we get this mediated. We've got to change this.
That's
and you know, it, so
and Brain Gym is a common, I mean, you can get Brain Gym exercises on Amazon all day long.
Well, and they include them in school, in public school education. Many teachers are now importing Brain Gym exercises to help their children who do have subtle problems across the midline, which were never identified and never isolated and treated.
And they do help. And they do make a difference, but you have to be to that level. When we started vision therapy, when we finished 18 months later, the ophthalmologist said, well, your daughter's finally at a place where most people start.
There we go.
So
and Jodee, what did they mean when they said that? What did they mean about what her eyes were actually doing or not doing in the eye orbits? The eye itself has muscles inside it has reflexes inside the eye, and there are muscular movements that make it go back and forth. What were her eyes doing or not doing at that moment?
She was just beginning to see and isolate foreground from background.
There you go.
So
she inside the eye.
Yeah.
not even where the eye is targeting.
Right. She
Right.
was beginning to move her eyes from side to side.
Wow.
Now you have to realize not only was she prenatally exposed, but she had 4 homes before she came to us. So this little person at 5 months old had a lot of trauma because it's emotional trauma to lose everything you own and know and is common in your life, to just have it uprooted and passed on to another family and with new smells and she was a pretty traumatized kid when we got her. So she wasn't looking at human beings. I mean, when we got her, those little eyes did not focus and did not look at us. She never really got the full pupillary response.
Mm-hmm.
And so she tended to wear sunglasses even as an adult.
Right, because she had photophobia. She had oversensitivity to light.
Her kitchen had pink shears on it so that the lighting in the kitchen was still, you could see inside the kitchen because she liked her kitchen, but it was rose colored. The atmosphere was all rosy. That was the color she preferred to live in. And her home was dim. I'm one of those people where open the drapes, open the windows, bring in the air, let that happen. Let me go in and be cozy and safe.
Yeah, let me be in my cocoon.
Yeah.
So
one of the reasons that I had brought that up is because so much of our discussion is explaining why folks are not getting the results promised by traditional techniques.
By doing wonderful things like brain gym.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. And even mindful movements and things. There's some new things out there that are absolutely awesome. But if you haven't replaced and fixed, or at least seen how far you can come with some of these reflexes, your child doesn't have an opportunity. And we learned that. When she was first brain stunned.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, I'm like, there's another primitive reflex. I don't know. I mean, we really worked it and I really embraced it and worked with it. But it was like, there's something else here. There's something we missed.
I hope that you have enjoyed this Meliorist Monday, first of a series of team discussions with the FASD Meliorists. Yes, I left you on a cliffhanger in the middle of a paragraph, as a matter of fact. So tune in next week to get the rest of the story. In the meantime, reach out if you would like, Living with FASD podcast at gmail.com, or visit my website, patriciakasper.com, if you want to explore trainings or coaching. Thank you very much. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Monday on Living with FASD.